I once thought the most painful thing in my life was being treated like nothing more than my sister's shadow by my own family. But I was wrong. The real pain was sitting in the back row at her perfect wedding, watching everything fall apart because of one microphone and a few truths that had been buried for far too long. That day, it wasn't just Serena's marriage that collapsed. It was also the end of my 29 years of silence. My name is Mila West. And if I had to sum up my childhood in one sentence, it would be this. I grew up in a house where beauty determined a child's worth. From a very young age, I understood that in my parents' eyes, I was not the daughter they were proud of. I was the one who was fine, pretty in her own way. Not someone who needed to stand out. Serena, on the other hand, was the son that everything in our family revolved around. My mother looked at her as if she were the perfect version of herself, the one she might have become if life had given her more luck. Serena had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a face that made even strangers turn around for a second look. I had brown hair, brown eyes, and a face my mother once described as pleasant. I know she thought that was comforting, but to me, it felt like a sentence. Very early on, I understood that I was never anyone's first choice. I learned how to stay quiet, how to shrink myself, how to disappear before anyone else could make me disappear. In my house, everything revolved around Serena. Her feelings mattered more. Her achievements meant more. Her future was seen as more worth investing in. I was more like the backup plan. The child my parents believed only needed food, school, and enough space to grow up on her own. I was not raised on pride. I was raised on neglect. And the most frightening part is that it took me years to realize that this was not normal. I used to think I was not hurting. But the truth was that I had lived with the pain for so long that I no longer knew how to call it by its real name. My mother had been a beauty pageant contestant in her youth. She never actually won. But she always talked about the times she had almost made it with a kind of regret that never really faded. When Serena started growing up and showing all the qualities my mother had once wished for in herself, I knew right away that she had chosen Serena to live out that dream for her. Every weekend, she took Serena to pageants, rehearsals, photo shoots, and classes where she learned how to smile, pose, and walk like someone born to be admired. Meanwhile, I walked to the library alone, while my mother stood in front of the mirror fixing Serena's hair. I sat in the corner with a book in my hands, trying to convince myself that this was fine too. I did not resent Serena for being loved. What hurt was that I barely seemed to exist in that picture at all. When I did well in school, no one was excited. When I needed someone to show up for me, my family was always busy with one of Serena's programs, competitions, or photo sessions. I still remember being honored for academic achievement in 8th grade. I sat in the auditorium, watching parents come up one by one to congratulate their children, while the seats reserved for mine stayed empty. They were busy taking Serena to a regional pageant. My father called and promised we would celebrate when they got home, but they forgot, and I pretended it did not matter. Little by little, I came to understand that love in my house was not shared equally. It was all poured into a single glass, and I got whatever was left. If anything, my mother always said Serena needed to be invested in, while I was the child who could take care of herself. It sounded like praise for being strong, but in truth, it was just the kind of thing people say to justify neglecting a child. There was one time, when I was much younger, that I opened the hallway closet and found the family photo albums. I sat on the floor, flipping through them with the innocent hope that maybe I had remembered things wrong. Maybe my parents did love me in their own way, and I just had not been able to see it. But every page only confirmed the truth more coldly. Serena in child beauty pageants. Serena in performances. Serena smiling. Serena, receiving awards. Serena beside birthday cakes. Serena, in glittering dresses. Serena under the lights. And me. After counting over and over, I found only 3 pages. One picture from when I was little. One from kindergarten. And one from my high school graduation with half my face cut out. I can still remember exactly how that felt. It was not the kind of pain that makes you burst into tears right away. It was more like being hollowed out from the inside. I looked at those pages and understood that my family had written the story of their lives with almost no need for me in it. I was not the main character. I was not even an important supporting one. I was just the person standing outside the frame so often that everyone, including me, had come to believe it made sense. At the time, I told myself I did not need photographs to prove that I existed. I had books, grades, and private little worlds to disappear into. But years later, I became honest enough to admit that some part of me had always been waiting to be seen, waiting to be chosen, waiting for someone to say, "You matter too." I spent 29 years living with that hunger for love, hiding it behind a calm exterior. And maybe that is why I kept trying with my family for so long. Because deep down, I was still that little girl sitting in front of that photo album, hoping the next page would finally have more of me in it. 3 years ago, Serena brought Brandon Hayes home. And from that day on, the atmosphere in my family changed completely. Brandon was the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone instantly aware that he came from a different world. Not because he showed off, but because everything about him was built on such solid ground. The Hayes family had old money. The kind of wealth that never has to announce itself to make other people shrink a little. At the very first dinner where we met him, my mother was practically glowing. I still remember the moment she pulled my father into the kitchen and lowered her voice as if it were a secret. Though not enough to keep me from hearing a Hayes. Can you even imagine it, our Serena with a Hayes? After that night, every conversation in the house revolved around Brandon. His job, his family, his house in Connecticut, his mother's tastes, his friends, the kind of winter wedding his family might like. My parents no longer saw Serena as just their beautiful daughter. They started seeing her as the family's ticket to a better life. Every dinner felt like a strategy meeting, with Serena's future being mapped out as carefully as a plan for social climbing. I sat there and listened, quiet as always. No one asked what I thought. No one cared how my life was going. Only Serena mattered. My mother once said something I have never forgotten. This relationship could change everything for our family. She said it right in front of me, as if I were a chair in the room instead of her daughter. That sentence made one thing painfully clear. Serena was not just loved. She was being invested in like an asset. And me, I was the one with no return. So I was not worth any extra effort. By then, I had already been with Daniel for 2 years. He was a high school literature teacher. Not rich. Not glamorous. Not from a family with real estate or trust funds. But he was the first person in my life who never made me feel like a second choice. Daniel remembered my birthday. Remembered the kind of tea I liked. Even remembered the little stories I told in passing, and then forgot about myself. He listened to me as if I deserved to be heard. That alone felt so unfamiliar it almost hurt. When I brought him home to meet my family, my mother looked him up and down and gave him a polite, practiced smile. A teacher. That's nice. Then she turned to ask my father about Serena and Brandon's weekend trip. As if the man I loved had disappeared from the table. 3 months later, Daniel proposed to me in our small apartment with his grandmother's ring. There was no photographer. No luxury rooftop. No perfect script. Just a man trembling so hard he could barely get the words out because he loved me that sincerely. I said yes before he could even finish. It was the most beautiful moment of my life. But I did not have the courage to tell my family right away. I knew they would make it feel small. Then one evening, when my mother excitedly announced an $85,000 budget for Serena's wedding, I thought maybe it was time to speak up. I told them that Daniel and I were engaged too, and that we wanted a small wedding in the spring. My mother set down her wine glass and looked at me as if I had just told a joke that was not funny enough to deserve a laugh. Then she asked, "Do you really think anyone would come after that?" She said they had to invest wisely. Because Serena was the beautiful one. The one worth spending money on. My father lowered his head and said nothing. That silence hurt even more than my mother's words. If your chest tightened hearing that, then you already understand why that was the first time I truly realized that. In my own parents' eyes. I had never once been seen as a bride worth celebrating. 2 weeks later, I went to Serena's engagement party alone because Daniel had not been invited. My sister said seating was limited, and that only immediate family had been prioritized. I knew exactly what prioritized meant in our house. The party was held at the Hayes estate, where everything was so polished and luxurious that I felt like I had wandered into the pages of an expensive magazine. The servers moved so smoothly they seemed to barely touch the ground. And the champagne glasses looked like they cost more than a month of my rent. I drifted through a crowd of strangers, smiling when I had to, nodding when it was polite, and trying not to let myself feel too out of place. That was when I really noticed Tyler Hayes, Brandon's younger brother. If Brandon was the kind, reserved type, Tyler had something sharper about him, something more dangerous. He had the kind of handsome face that made people look a second too long. But that was not what caught my attention. It was the way he looked at Serena. That look was not the kind a future brother-in-law gives a future sister-in-law. It was too slow, too heated, too full of desire. I had seen looks like that in films, in novels, in stories people do not dare to name out loud. Then Serena turned toward Tyler, and something quick passed between them, like a spark of electricity. No one else around them seemed to notice. But I did. I told myself I was being overly sensitive. Maybe I was trying to find flaws in Serena because my mother had humiliated me. Maybe I was jealous. Maybe I was seeing problems where there were none. And yet the feeling would not leave me. It stayed with me the entire night. Even without any proof. I could not shake the sense that there was some kind of secret between Serena and Tyler. What frightened me most was Serena's expression whenever she glanced at him. It was not the face of a woman with nothing to hide. At that party, I also met Robert Hayes, Brandon's uncle, who introduced himself as the family's unofficial photographer. He had silver hair curling slightly at his temples, a gentle smile, and the eyes of someone who had seen too much to be easily surprised. We spoke for a few minutes, mostly because he was one of the rare people there who looked at me as if I were a real person rather than just the shadow trailing behind Serena. When he found out I was the bride-to-be's sister, he simply smiled and said, "Ah, the sister Serena never mentions." He said it lightly, but it still felt like something sharp sliding into my chest. He showed me a few of the photos he had just taken on his camera. Serena smiling beside Brandon. My parents beaming. Champagne glass. Perfectly arranged smiles. I looked at those pictures and had the strange feeling that everyone inside the frame was performing some kind of role. Then Robert said something I never forgot. Cameras are fascinating. They catch moments people think no one saw. At the time, I only gave him a tight smile and assumed it was just the sort of thing a photographer would say. I had no idea that later, those words would become one of the most important pieces of the disaster that was quietly approaching. There was something about Robert that made me believe he knew more than he was saying. Not in a nosy, gossip-hungry way, but with the calm alertness of someone who had been around long enough to understand that every family has another side beneath its polished surface. Before he walked away to keep taking pictures, he lifted his camera slightly, almost as if to remind me that sooner or later, everything would be recorded. At the time, I did not think much of it, but later that night, when I kept replaying Tyler's gaze, Serena's secretive smile, and Robert's words in my mind, I began to feel that something was quietly building beneath that perfect surface. That night, when I got home, Daniel took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. He sat me down on the couch and wrapped his arms around me as if he wanted to shield me from the weight of the whole world pressing down on me. Daniel had never forced me to choose between him and my family. But he had also never pretended that the way they treated me was normal. He asked why I kept going back. Why I kept showing up to dinners that only hurt me. Why I kept hoping for something from people who had failed to truly see me for almost 30 years. I was about to give the same old excuses I always used to defend them. Things like they don't mean it or that's just how they are. But that night I could not bring myself to say any of it. I admitted to Daniel that I had always been hoping for the day my parents would look at me the way they looked at Serena. I knew it sounded childish. Even pathetic? Especially at 29. But it was the truth. Some part of me was still waiting to be chosen. Still waiting for someone in my family to say that I was good enough. Pretty enough. Important enough to be proud of. Daniel listened without interrupting me. Without judging me. And then he said one simple thing. You matter to me. And you will always be my first choice. That was what made me break down and cry like a child. I cried for every time I had been forgotten. Diminished. Pushed into the role of supporting character in my own family. I told him that this would be the last time. I would go to Serena's wedding. Sit through their perfect day. And then I would stop. I would stop chasing a version of family that only ever made me feel small. When I made that promise to Daniel, I truly believed I could close that chapter quietly. I had no idea that fate was preparing to throw open one last door, forcing me to see both the truth and myself more clearly than ever before. 3 months before the wedding, Serena held her bachelorette party at a luxurious boutique hotel in the city center. I was told to arrive early, but not as an honored guest or the bride's sister. I was there to help set up the gift table, check the appetizers, direct the waitstaff, and handle whatever little tasks came up. To put it plainly, I was there as unpaid help. Serena assigned me those jobs so naturally, as if that had always been the most appropriate role for me in her life. I did everything without arguing or complaining, because I was far too used to being pushed into the background. When I finally sat down with a sandwich I had barely touched, one of Serena's friends came over, looked me up and down, and remarked on how different Serena and I looked. Before I could answer, Serena stepped in, gave a light laugh, patted me on the shoulder in front of everyone, and introduced me as the family's organized little sister. Not beautiful, not striking, not accomplished, just useful. Hearing that, I felt myself being pushed back into a very old, a very familiar box. Helpful. Oops to I, but never worth noticing. Then I caught Serena secretly texting under the table. She was smiling in a way I recognized instantly. The kind of smile a woman wears when she is waiting for a message from someone who makes her heart race. But Brandon was at another party that night. So who was making Serena look like that? I told myself it could just be a friend. Something innocent. Something normal. But deep down, my old suspicion came rushing back stronger than ever. By then, the glances between Serena and Tyler at the engagement party no longer felt like something I could brush aside. Everything was beginning to connect into a picture I still did not have the courage to name. 3 days after that party, I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it. But that day, something made me answer. The man on the other end introduced himself as Marcus Reed, Brandon's best man and closest friend. I only vaguely remembered him from the engagement party, a tall, serious man with the kind of eyes that seemed to notice more than he said. Marcus did not waste time. He told me he needed to meet with me privately because it was about Serena. That one sentence alone made my heart drop straight into my stomach. I asked what it was, but he refused to explain over the phone. He only said, "There's something you need to know. About your sister." I had a dozen reasons to say no. I did not want to get involved in Serena's business. I especially did not want to be dragged into a pre-wedding disaster. But at the same time, I could not ignore the feeling I had been carrying for weeks. The secret smile while texting under the table. The way Tyler looked at her. Robert's comment about the things a camera can catch. And more than anything, some part of me, the part that had stayed silent for 29 years, suddenly did not want to keep standing outside the story of my own family. So I agreed to meet Marcus at a cafe the next afternoon. That night, Daniel looked at me with concern when I told him someone wanted to talk to me about Serena. He said I was not obligated to involve myself in anything that might hurt me even more. I understood what he meant. But this time, my instinct was no longer to avoid the truth. I wanted to know it, no matter how ugly it was. And if you have made it this far and can already feel the pieces starting to fall into place, remember to like the video here. Because from the moment Marcus called me, everything began to spin out of control in a way no one could stop. Marcus was already waiting at the cafe when I arrived. He was sitting alone in front of a cup of black coffee, looking exhausted, as if he had not slept properly in days. The moment I sat down, the air around the table felt heavy enough to choke on. Marcus got straight to the point. He said Brandon was like a brother to him. The kind of man who was too kind and too trusting for his own good. And that he could not stay silent knowing the truth. Then he said the name that sent a chill through me, Tyler. Marcus told me he had seen Serena and Tyler together several times. In situations that could not possibly be explained away as innocent. Once, Serena had left Tyler's apartment at 2 a.m. Another time, the two of them had disappeared from a restaurant at the same time. In a voice full of certainty, Marcus said this was no longer just suspicion. It was an ongoing affair. I sat there with my hands wrapped around my latte, barely taking a sip, trying to keep my face calm while everything inside me was in chaos. Marcus asked if I had ever noticed anything strange. I thought back to the engagement party, the bachelorette party, Tyler's eyes, Serena's smile whenever she texted. I could not say that I knew for sure. But I also could not pretend I had seen nothing. Marcus begged me to help him convince Brandon. Or at the very least, confirm that he was not imagining any of this. He said Brandon would never believe him unless someone else also admitted that it could be true. I should have stood up and walked away. I should have kept myself out of that entire mess. But in that moment, I realized I was not only afraid of the scandal, I was also afraid of another truth, that the woman my family had spent years admiring, protecting, and building their hopes around, might actually be living a lie. And if that was true, then for all those years, I had been making myself smaller to leave room for an image that was never as worthy as they believed. A few weeks later came the rehearsal dinner before the wedding. Held in an old, elegant restaurant with dark wood, crystal chandeliers, and that kind of old-money atmosphere that made everyone lower their voice the moment they walked in. I was sitting in my usual place at the very end of the table, beside some of the older Hayes relatives who could hardly remember my name. While everyone laughed and talked about the wedding day ahead, I excused myself and wandered toward the back of the room. That was where I found Robert Hayes standing alone with his camera in hand, quietly scrolling through the photos he had taken that evening. I joked and asked whether he had managed to capture any good shots. Robert turned toward me and smiled. But the smile faded almost immediately when he paused on one particular image on the screen. I only caught a glimpse of two figures standing far too close together in a dark corner before he quickly clicked to the next photo. His jaw tightened, and under his breath, he murmured, "Some moments should never be captured." The words made my skin prickle. I asked if something was wrong. But right then Brandon called him over for a family photo. And Robert instantly put his polite smile back on as if nothing had happened. I went back to my seat with my thoughts spinning. If Robert had seen something in those photos, then Marcus had probably not exaggerated anything. After dinner, as I walked out to the parking lot, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. Just one short line: "Robert saw something. I'm sure of it." My heart pounded so hard I had to stand still for a moment before I could even open my car door. By then, everything had moved far beyond stolen glances and uneasy instincts. Something had been recorded. Proof existed somewhere. And for the first time, I understood clearly that this wedding was no longer a story about a joyful celebration. It was a bomb waiting for the right person to light the fuse. A week before the wedding, Marcus called me again. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something major had happened. He said it plainly: "I've got it. Everything we need." I dropped onto the couch, my heart racing. Marcus told me that Robert had finally cooperated and given him a video from the engagement party. One that showed Serena and Tyler kissing in a corner of the garden. Convinced no one was watching. And that was not all. Marcus also had screenshots of messages between the two of them, going back for months. Those messages came from Tyler's ex-girlfriend, who had once suspected he was cheating and had kept the evidence from his iPad. When Marcus said, "It's bad," I knew immediately he was not exaggerating. I listened as he described the short exchanges between Serena and Tyler. The longing. The secret plans to meet. The lines like, "He doesn't need to know." The kind of words that made me shiver just imagining them. I was not in love with Brandon, but hearing all of that still hurt on his behalf. Worse than that, I knew if the truth came out, it would not just destroy a wedding, it would bring down the entire pedestal my parents had spent 30 years building for Serena. Right in front of everyone, Marcus asked me what I wanted him to do. He said he could give everything to Brandon that very night and end it before the wedding ever happened. Part of me wanted exactly that. I wanted the truth to come out before Brandon walked down the aisle as a man being completely deceived. But another part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime being accused of jealousy, bitterness, and ruining things, was terrified. I was afraid that if my name appeared anywhere in it, the whole story would instantly be twisted into, "The plain, jealous sister ruined Serena's happiness." That fear was not irrational. My own family had raised it inside me for years. And in the end, I chose to step back. When Marcus asked if I wanted to stop the wedding immediately, I stayed silent for a long time. So many faces ran through my mind. Serena in the wedding dress my mother had been excitedly talking about for months, always making sure to mention the price. My parents with that proud expression, as if this wedding were the crowning achievement of our entire family. Brandon standing at the altar, having no idea he was about to marry a woman who had betrayed him with his own brother. And then there was me, the person who could so easily be cast as the villain just by standing in the wrong place in this story. In the end, I told Marcus not to drag me into it. If he needed to tell the truth, that was his decision. But I could not be the one to light the match. The moment I said it, I felt ashamed of myself. Not because I had done something wrong, but because I realized I was still more afraid of how my family would see me than of what someone else had actually done. I had lived so long under the shadow of being the jealous younger sister that even when Serena was clearly in the wrong, my first instinct was still to believe no one would trust me. Marcus did not judge me. He only asked if I was sure. I said yes. even though deep down I was not sure of anything at all. That night, Daniel found me sitting alone in the dark living room. I told him the outline of what was happening, without going into every detail, just enough for him to understand that a storm was coming. Daniel held me and told me that none of this was my responsibility. He was right. But some storms pull you in simply because you are standing too close. I could not stop it. I also did not want to be the one to unleash it. So I chose the only thing I thought might protect me, to stay still and wait. To wait and see how the truth would find its own way out. I had no idea that only 7 days later, I would be sitting near the back of a lavish wedding, watching everything explode right in front of me. On the morning of Serena's wedding, the sky was gray and heavy. The kind of weather that makes hair frizz, and photographers keep glancing upward like they are silently praying. By noon, the clouds had started to thin, and a pale light spread across the vast grounds of Westfield Estate. Just enough for everyone to call it perfect wedding photo weather. I arrived alone. Daniel had offered to drive me there, wait in the parking lot, and take me home the second I wanted to leave. But his name was not on the invitation. Once again, Serena had said, "Seating is limited." In that voice that sounded polite on the surface but fake enough to sting. I walked into the venue feeling like an unwelcome guest in my own family. My seat was row 15. Chair, 23. Almost at the very back. Position 299 out of 300 guests. I sat against the wall, far enough away that no one would have to notice me, but close enough to witness everything. The room slowly filled with guests' designer dresses, tailored suits, handshakes, laughter, and that polished air of wealth I had never belonged to. Then I saw Marcus standing near the front with the groomsmen. His face was calm in a way that felt almost frightening. The kind of calm that belongs to someone who has already braced himself for an explosion. Tyler stood not far away, beads of sweat forming even though the room was full of air conditioning. I looked at him and could see the anxiety moving through every small gesture. When the music began and Serena appeared in the doorway, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. She was beautiful. The expensive lace gown, the long veil, the perfect smile. All of it was exactly what my mother had dreamed of. I watched my father walk her down the aisle with a pride I had spent my whole life longing for and had never once received. Sitting there near the back, I felt both pain and clarity at the same time. My place in this family, it turned out, had been assigned as precisely as the seating chart always in the last row. Close enough to be present, but never close enough to be fully seen. The wedding ceremony itself went strangely smoothly. Brandon held Serena's hands at the altar with a face full of trust. And that alone made my chest tighten. He read his vows with a sincerity that was almost painful to hear. Speaking about honesty, faithfulness, and the foundation of marriage. While I sat there knowing there were truths he had no idea existed, Serena answered without a tremor in her voice, without missing a beat. Still the woman who knew exactly how to perform in every frame she stepped into. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the whole room burst into applause. And I found myself clapping too, almost out of reflex. Maybe when you are surrounded by that much dishonesty, you still cling to the last bits of politeness, just to keep yourself from losing your mind. By the time the reception began, the setting was even more extravagant. White roses, candlelight, crystal glasses, and the bride and groom's first dance beneath a chandelier. I was seated at one of the back tables with strangers who did not even bother to ask my name. Then my mother stepped up with a microphone. She spoke about Serena using every beautiful word I had spent my whole life wishing I could hear about myself just once. Pride. Extraordinary daughter. Someone born for great things. I listened without surprise anymore. Then she let her eyes sweep across the room and said, "My other daughter is here somewhere too. Mila." Give us a wave. My other daughter. Not my youngest daughter. Not even my name first. Just the other one. That sentence rang out in front of 300 guests, like the final blow to every illusion I had still been holding on to. I did not wave. I did not smile. I just sat there, feeling something inside me finally die for good. It was no longer sadness. It was not even sudden anger. It was clarity, the realization that I had spent far too many years waiting for them to call me by my rightful place in their lives, when the truth was that they had never once tried to. After my mother's speech, the MC introduced the best man. Marcus stood up, straightened his tie, and walked to the stage with a calmness so cold, it was unsettling. At first, his voice was warm. Exactly the kind of wedding toast everyone expected. He talked about meeting Brandon in college. About how Brandon had always been the friend who showed up for everyone. The kind of man who was loyal, kind, and believed that any relationship worth having had to be built on truth. People laughed, nodded, raised their glasses. Brandon smiled too. But I caught something in Marcus's voice. A tiny crack. A hardness underneath it. The kind of shift you only notice if you are listening closely enough to realize he is leading everyone somewhere else. Then Marcus said that Brandon deserved the truth. Always. The room started to go quiet. Serena froze halfway through, reaching for her water glass. Tyler went pale instantly. I felt my skin turn cold as Marcus paused for one beat and then said that before he finished. He wanted everyone to see what real love looked like. The large screen behind the head table lit up. At first, I thought it was just the usual wedding slideshow. But then the image came into focus, a shadowed corner of the garden at the engagement party. Two people pressed tightly together in the dark. And when they lifted their heads, the entire room seemed to freeze. Serena, Tyler, kissing, gasps, breaking glass, chairs scraping backward. It all happened almost at once. But that was only the beginning. The screen shifted to screenshots of text messages. The words were blown up so large that no one could pretend not to read them. Secret plans. Longing. Lines that openly admitted to seeing each other behind Brandon's back. Serena screamed for it to be turned off. Brandon stood there in shock, white as paper, then slowly turned toward his wife. His wife of less than an hour, with the face of a man whose soul had just been ripped open in front of a crowd. When Brandon asked Serena to tell him it was all fake, I could barely breathe. He did not start by yelling. He did not start by smashing anything. The very first thing he did was beg for a denial. No matter how fragile or unbelievable it might be. But Serena could not give him one. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again without finding a single sentence strong enough to save herself. That silence was the fatal wound. Because inside it, all 300 people understood that the video was real. The messages were real. And the groom was standing there in the middle of the worst betrayal a man could endure, being deceived by both his wife and his own brother. Then everything exploded. Brandon lunged across the table at Tyler, sending champagne glasses crashing to the floor. Flowers toppling. People screaming. It took 3 groomsmen to hold him back. But he still managed to land one punch that sent Tyler stumbling down. I had never heard a sound like Brandon's when he shouted, "My own brother." Tyler stammered out an apology and said it had meant nothing, which was probably the stupidest thing he could have said in that moment. Serena rushed between them, crying and begging Brandon to let her explain. But he shoved her away as if he had just touched something poisonous. Guests either started running for the exits or stood there filming, like people watching a disaster they could not look away from. Brandon's mother collapsed into a chair, whispering, "This can't be happening." And Serena, the woman who had moved through my life like an untouchable queen, was now standing frozen in her $15,000 wedding dress, surrounded by roses and broken glass. For one brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered every time I had been treated like an afterthought. Every time I had been diminished so she could shine brighter. The feeling vanished quickly. Not because I was cruel, but because by then, I no longer owed her my sympathy. In the middle of all that chaos, I almost forgot where my parents were. When I finally looked back, I saw them standing near the head table like two statues that had just been struck by lightning, right through the perfect life they had built around Serena. My mother was gripping my father's sleeve so tightly her knuckles had gone white. And my father looked as if he had aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. Then my mother saw me. She rushed over, grabbed both my arms, and asked in a trembling voice, "You knew, didn't you? You knew and you said nothing." And for the first time in my life, I did not avoid her gaze. I did not apologize. I did not scramble to calm someone else's anger. I simply answered, very calmly, that I had my suspicions. My mother nearly screamed, demanding to know why I had not warned them, why I had let things go this far. And in that moment, the absurdity of it all almost made me laugh. I looked back at her and asked, "If I had told you, would you have believed me?" She went still. Then I continued, slowly and clearly, as if I were finally speaking the truth I had carried inside me for 30 years. "If I had told you Serena was cheating on Brandon, would you have believed me? Or would you have said I was jealous? Would you have believed your other daughter? Or would you have chosen Serena again?" Like you always do, my mother opened her mouth, then closed it again, because she already knew the answer. And in that moment, I understood that I had nothing left to prove. I did not need to keep trying to be the good one. I did not need to rush in and clean up Serena's wreckage. I did not need to become the organized daughter and help the family survive yet another crisis. When my mother clutched at me and said Serena needed me, I finally said the thing I should have said long ago. I was too tired of fixing the messes of people who had never treated me with kindness. I pulled my arms free from her hands. Not angrily. Not bitterly. Just firmly. It was the first time in my life that I truly chose myself. I walked out of the reception hall and found Daniel waiting for me in the parking lot, leaning against the car door as if he had already known I would need somewhere to collapse. On the drive home, I cried. But not for Serena or for the wedding that had just fallen apart. I cried for the little girl who once sat counting photos in a family album and realized she had never really been remembered. I cried for the 29-year-old woman who had finally stopped waiting to be seen. The fallout came quickly in the weeks that followed. The wedding video spread all over social media. Serena lost hundreds of thousands of followers, lost brand deals, lost her luxury apartment, and lost the perfect image she had built her life around. Tyler was cut off from every form of support from the Hayes family. And Brandon moved immediately to have the marriage annulled. My mother called me afterward. And for the first time, her voice was smaller. But she only apologized for not realizing who Serena really was. I forced her to face the bigger question. What about me? What about 30 years of treating me unfairly? It took much longer for my father to send me the first real apology of his life. I do not know whether they have changed completely. But I know this much: I am no longer willing to live on blind hope. Daniel and I decided to have a small wedding in his parents' backyard. There were only about 35 guests. A $300 vintage dress, wildflowers, pouring rain, an old tent, and a lot of genuine laughter. It was not perfect, but it was mine. On the day I married Daniel, my parents came. They sat in the second row and cried for me. Not for the image of some ideal daughter. Serena did not come. But she sent flowers and a card. Maybe it was not forgiveness yet. And maybe it was not reconciliation either. But it was a small beginning. What I learned from all of this is simple. My worth does not depend on who chooses me first. It depends on the fact that I finally learned to choose myself. If this story touched you, if you have ever been the backup plan, the one always compared to someone else, the child people looked past in your own family, then remember this. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and come with me into the next videos.